Gentlemen, welcome.
Afternoon, Mark.
Thank you, Matt.
How are we doing? We've got some echo. Someone's got some echo.
Gentlemen, welcome.
Thank you, Matt.
How are we doing?
I know what it is.
Someone's got some echo.
Now it's gone. I had YouTube open in another window. Can you believe it? And so it's coming back 10 seconds later. My goodness, that's a mistake I won't make again. First time ever. Guys, welcome to episode number 7 of Scotch AI. Fantastic to have you join us for the live stream. We've got some very esteemed guests here to discuss our topic for this episode, which is use cases for artificial intelligence and machine learning in the telco vertical. Now, telco I've worked in, as has James and Jose for that matter, and Dr. Chris I'm not so sure about. There may be some telco background there. But James and myself both did time at Optus, Jose at Telefonica, and recently in Australia with NBN Co. Am I right, Jose?
That's correct. Yeah, also with Telco Digital.
Fantastic. And so what's interesting about it is that I guess if there's a vertical that's facing massive disruption right now, it's telco. I mean, their traditional business model's been completely disrupted. They're totally disintermediated in terms of, it used to be you could charge significant amounts of money for bandwidth, for voice over copper, voice over 2G, 3G, 4G, now data over 4G and 5G. But it's increasingly the case that the revenue is moving towards the content providers, and the telco is there left holding these big expensive pipes and watching the money and the value fly from one end to the other. And it's an interesting situation that the telcos find themselves in, I believe. So we're going to be tossing around what's happening in the telco vertical. I've got some experts here on AI and machine learning, and we'll look at the responses that we're seeing in that vertical, where who's on the cutting edge of innovation, who is driving value out of the huge volumes of data that a telco has, which is actually phenomenal when you think about it. And right down to granular detail, every individual phone call, every web click, every web session, every browser, every app on your phone, the data is absolutely huge. If there was a definition of big data, in fact, big data probably came, first of all, out of telco, perhaps more than any other vertical. But let's introduce our guests now that I've introduced the topic. I'd love to hear a couple of, just a background for yourself. Let's go to Jose. Tell us about yourself a little bit, Jose.
Yeah, I'm a software engineer currently working for Google, although has nothing to do with what I'm doing here today. As you said, no, I've been working as a data scientist and machine learning engineer for 5 years since I arrived to Australia, covering many different sectors, including telco with 2 different companies here in Australia, and also Telefonica in Spain, as you mentioned, in different roles in the business side and also in the R&D side. But mostly I'm passionate about data science and machine learning and the possibilities that it can bring to any business. And yeah, hoping I can contribute to the discussion today.
Sounds good. I'm sure you will. Dr. Chris Cook, just letting you, well done, came off mute. Tell us about yourself, brother.
Thanks, Mark. Yes, I do actually have a bit of a telco background. I worked for Ericsson for a year or so when I got back from the UK. I actually ran the Network Operations Center for Ericsson.
Wow.
They had outsourced a number of countries' telephone systems, including the 3 network here in Australia, a satellite network. I ran the Fiji operations as well. So, yeah, so I've got a pretty good understanding of what goes on in a network operations center from a telco point of view. And back then, even with 3G, content was, to pick up on the topic that you mentioned, content was a big thing. And the network providers at that point were still trying to be in that content provision. And so some of those things. So I'm across what was going on back then, but you're right. The volume of data is just huge, and so I'm interested to explore with my colleagues on the call today what we can do using and leveraging machine learning and artificial intelligence for them. But my background is I started quite a few years ago with IBM. I've had some senior executive positions with people like Fujitsu and Computer Sciences Corporation. I made it as a partner in PricewaterhouseCoopers, but then the consulting arm there was purchased by IBM, and I'd already worked for them, so I said, "No, I'm not going to go back there." So I eventually started my own consulting business in machine learning. And I think, Jose, I gave you your first job in Sydney. Was that right?
No,
you gave me my first job in Sydney. I think that was the case. But no, Jose and I have been working together for quite some time now. But I recently completed a PhD in business decision making because I saw organizations not really knowing what to do with the results of information about the future, predictions. And how do business managers make decisions? They've got historical information, they've got current information in dashboards, but what do they do about future information? So that's why I explored that area and completed a PhD. I work at Data Robot now, helping organizations make use of the predictions that they're able to create quickly using automated machine learning. And that's, as I was sharing with James a little earlier, that's what really excites me. I just love seeing the way that people change the view of their business using this sort of technology. So James and I are on similar paths. I think James is a lot more technical than I am. I used to be a data scientist, although Jose might argue that point. But I've
not
got an
really.
engineering
No, I don't.
So I've got enough mathematics to be able to understand it, but I think the key thing is the bridge between business and data science, and that's really where I sit at the moment. So I'm keen to explore with this one.
Absolutely.
Now you have a PhD in your name, so nobody can question you, Chris.
It's interesting, actually. I was looking through each of your profiles, going, "Now, who's got a PhD? Who's got a PhD?" It was only. So, James, we've known each other from Optus days as well, and actually, introduce yourself, but also sanity check for me this hypothesis that telcos are struggling now with the changing realities and the shift to content, value in content rather than value in the transmission of voice and data.
Yeah, sure. So I'll just give a quick introduction. So yeah, I'm James. I don't have a PhD, but I work for H2O, who are the open source leader in AI and machine learning. And similar to Chris, I spend a lot of my time working with customers and our partners across Australia and New Zealand, helping them implement and get business value from machine learning, essentially. And because of this, I get exposed to kind of lots of interesting and exciting projects within the AI space across all industries. But telco, obviously, Mark, we met in telco. I've worked for telcos here in Australia and also back in the UK. So quite a bit of experience in that space, which hopefully, will help me, add some interesting kind of thoughts to this discussion. But kind of, I guess, back to your point about, where telcos are at and what they're doing. I think your intro was a really great summary, and it's kind of, very similar to my own experience. When I started my career kind of back in the UK, I worked for the Carphone Warehouse, which anyone from the UK will know well, sort of a kind of a more of a budget provider and kind of the first to give away fixed internet as part of a mobile plan. So this idea of bundling, the concept of reducing cost was kind of, very early kind of in my career in the telco space. But I think, kind of since then, we've seen increased competition across the globe and, reductions in terms of price. You mentioned, Mark, the idea of paying a high price for kind of access is, it's kind of a thing of the past now. People don't expect that. And I think, I was kind of thinking about this question before we started, this podcast, because I was thinking, well, why is that? Why is it that people think that? And some of the reasons kind of might be because of the content that's going through those pipes and their business models, right, which are typically very, very different. If you think about podcasts, social media, essentially free. You pay, you get advertising as part of, as part of the deal there. Or you've got others with kind of a blended approach. Things like YouTube, or kind of very low cost subscriptions like your Spotify, your Netflix. But this idea of paying, a large amount of money for a service is just kind of seems to be like a thing of the past. And it's interesting, isn't it? Because telcos are kind of part of that ecosystem now. Very innovative kind of modern ecosystem, and I guess the onus is on them now to kind of stay relevant, kind of within that space.
So how are they doing that?
Yeah.
Let's take, and I'll take a story from each of you, I think, on the thought leaders in the telco space. What are they doing to either drive new revenue streams or optimize existing revenue streams or cover their cost base, or how are they going to stay alive from a financial viability perspective, and how is AI and machine learning driving that? So have a think about that. Who wants to go first? Maybe James, you had a story you were just about to unpack.
I can go first. So there's a couple of things, a couple of sort of stories that might be interesting. Kind of the one that I was going to talk about, that we see is really, and kind of leading on from your point, Mark, about the amount of data that they have. And they do, telcos have a lot of data, and we see, H2O open source works particularly well in distributed environments, and we see lots of telcos using it because they have this huge amount of data, right? But the question then is, how do they potentially monetize that data in a safe, customer-centric, privacy-compliant way? And I think we're seeing a bit more of that kind of in the telco space, definitely. There's kind of the various kind of offspins of telcos now that do sort of components of that. So that's kind of interesting. I guess, kind of from an ML perspective as well. We work with a few telcos around the world. One of the big ones is AT&T in the US. And they're really using AI to try and harness that data to kind of gain competitive advantage across like lots of different use cases. So, various things.
One really good one. Give us the best.
Well, I think the idea is there isn't one single good one. I think the point is that they're building these kind of model factories where they're all good, right? But it's the summation that makes them great. So you've got everything from a customer perspective in terms of understanding what we should be recommending to certain people, what kind of products they'd be interested in, that kind of stuff. But as well as from a network perspective, like where should we be investing in our network to best serve our customers? How should we be, applying things like predictive maintenance? And then kind of the coming together of those two, so that ultimately you are building a telco which best serves your customers, in the best way using AI. I guess that's the goal. So, you're relevant in terms of what you offer them in terms of products, but your network performs in a way that makes sense for your customers.
Interesting. Yeah. So predictive maintenance is an interesting one. Jose, you've probably got a story. I know you worked at an Australian telco that was using their data to build predictive models around something like that. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, the story was like, okay, so on the network side, telcos have like a lot of data, all the collection that they do from all the equipment. You can exploit that and get a lot of information about the current usage and the future usage. You can make forecasts about the demand that you're going to have, right? But what we wanted to do in the project that you were referring to, I was working on, is about detecting usage patterns and be able to detect what kind of usage was having every customer, and cluster them and try to offer them services that maybe were still not defined. No, it's like, okay, let's help marketing to see what kind of bandwidth, what kind of capacity, we need to provide to these customers so that they have what they need, and we can get that extra revenue. So which ones are residential customers that maybe will have usage only after working hours? It will be mostly streaming of Netflix and video games during the weekend or nights, and which ones are business that are running from home maybe, and that will need maybe more reliability. Maybe they don't need much more bandwidth, because at the end of the day, with the standard 25 megabits per second, you can get a lot done, but they surely need more reliability, right? So, okay, let's try to figure out how we can segment the customers and find those patterns, because the telco didn't know which kind of customer was each. They just have addresses, and they don't know really who is running a business from home and who is just a home, no? But the moment you started studying the patterns, you could see really on a 7 by 24 matrix, you could really see which hours were lighting up with the high usage of those customers. Right? We could clearly identify the different cases and help marketing to provide better products that were more suitable for those users.
So that's like a clustering type approach based on usage patterns, yeah? And then how do we best service the different cohorts of customers?
Yeah, exactly. We're finding like 4 or 5 groups, mainly of customers based on which were the peak hours in which they were having most of their usage, right?
Sure. Yeah.
And then the aggregated download time.
What I'm curious about, I know that in manufacturing, there's been a lot of successes on predictive maintenance of machines. There's a signal in the noise, there's a signal in the behavior of the machine as it is approaching failure. And through the machine learning, being able to identify those patterns prior to a failure, you can predict future failures before they happen and then take preventative action so the failure doesn't happen. Has that happened anywhere in telco, that as far as any of you know, whether it's, over copper or over 4G, 5G?
I know of initiatives like that.
Look, I've done.
Sorry, jump in.
Maybe Chris, you want to go?
Yeah, look, that was one of the basics of the bases of the consulting company that I ran before I joined DataRobot. Was doing predictive maintenance, and the thing about telco is that in fact resilience is built into the network anyway. So your phone can see 4 or 5 different towers at any one time. It's not the engineering in the network isn't what the issue is. Anomaly detection is actually one of the bigger use cases, because it's not typically it's not a single failure, it's a multitude of failures. And so what you're trying to find is the signal in the noise. And when you talk with the hardware providers to the telcos, there's a blizzard of messages that come off when one little thing starts to happen. And you're trying to find the root cause of that, and root cause analysis is a big thing in an engineered network like a telco. But the challenge is being able to detect that this parameter was changed and that caused knock-on effects, and 3 days later you had a core system outage. So that is one of the big use cases that the hardware providers and the telcos are working on jointly with us at the moment. But it depends on the jurisdiction that you're in as well. So we're talking about Netflix, and we're talking about the streaming things. There's an article in I think it was ZD News or CNET recently, just in the last few days, that it was actually the gaming that blew out the consumption. It wasn't so much people working from home. Yes, it was a migration of geography, but it was actually the explosion in online gaming. It wasn't people binging on Netflix at home. So that's one of the issues there. But they're changing their billing model. Historically, and I've been involved with the telco industry for a long time, historically it was all driven by billing, the billing systems. Because to make a telephone call join from one part of the world to another part of the world across multiple networks, you've got multiple switches, and you've got to track that all the way through. And if you're billing by time, which is the way it used to be, between countries or even between geographies in Australia or New Zealand, for example, that connecting all those dots, the billing systems were what drove the market segmentation and what drove the pricing. If the billing system couldn't do it, you couldn't bill for it. Now, what we're getting to now is mass customization. Why can't I have Chris's own billing rates? Why am I grouped with somebody else? And with computers and with the systems that we have now, we're still bound. Most telcos are still bound by their billing system. So it's very hard to do this. But why can't I have time of day billing? We have it in the electricity industry. We have off-peak and peak, and we have shoulder and all those kind of things. And my usage, I attenuate my usage to the best times for me. But we went away from time billing, we went to volume billing. And we're still clustering customers and trying to bill customers as if they're almost all homogenous within that group. Well, they're not.
Yeah, that's an interesting one, because in a lot of industries around marketing, they'll talk about the ideal outcome of some kind of AI or machine learning initiative is the segment of one, you know, so the mathematics, the algorithm is sophisticated enough to micro segment right down to the individual usage pattern and then target something at that particular individual user, rather than, you know, 5 segments or 3 segments or 10 segments. It sounds like that's
if you know anything about how the network operates, you know, from an engineering point of view, they attenuate the network, so not every base station is blasting out full power. Certainly in a city like Sydney, like Auckland with hills, with the 7 hills of Rome, you've got similar problems. You've got dark spots, you've got more powerful spots, and if you're up high in a building, sometimes you've got 20 different base stations that you can see from that height. And that's the challenge. The network is then bouncing you around from one to another as you walk around the floor of a building, if you're on the 31st floor, for example. But that maintaining the voice continuity is one thing, but maintaining the data continuity is another. What we tried to do back in, 20 years ago, was attenuate the mobile network to VIP users. And this came about because the owner of the 3 network in Hong Kong came to Australia and had 7 video phones in the back of his limousine as he drove around Sydney, testing the 3 network for video conferencing on the mobile phone.
Interesting.
Now, the thing was, we wanted to make sure that they had that individual, who's a Hong Kong billionaire, of course, got the best service possible. So we're trying to attenuate the network manually. Wouldn't it be great if you could do that automatically using AI as you've picked individual consumers and they are paying for a VIP service?
Yeah, so, I remember discussing that possibility when I think back at EMC, we were trying to sell solutions like that. And we talked about Vodafone UK, who were looking at a similar kind of attempts. You know, it's interesting. My perception of the telco industry is that it does tend to be slow and reactive, and they only get dragged kicking and screaming into adopting and investing money in new technologies. Is that a fair evaluation? Is it really only the thought leaders who are doing this kind of stuff, and everybody else, all the other telcos, are really just trying to get their data warehouse right and do the kind of rear vision reporting that we've been doing for the last 20, 30 years? What do you think?
It depends which telco and in which jurisdiction, because I've worked recently across the Southeast Asian region with multiple telcos, and the thing there is that they've all got different billing systems and billing mechanisms. So the fact that a diesel-powered with solar backup base station goes down in Australia isn't such a big deal, because another base station will pick it up. But there's only one base station, and they're billing minutes. So their billing mechanism drives availability of the network requirement, because if the base station's down, they can't be billing minutes. It's lost revenue. So it's that kind, and obviously customer satisfaction bruises and things like that. So it depends on which part of the industry you're talking about, which location you're talking, and what is the billing mechanism and the go-to-market approach of that particular telco.
So it might be in the case that in the more developed countries, we've over-invested in network resilience, and therefore we don't need to be super smart about making sure that every little dropout gets picked up or rectified. Whereas in an environment where perhaps that level of redundancy has not been made because of financial reasons, a developing nation, they could flip it around and use smart AI to still optimize their network usage. Interesting possibility.
I think there's new ways, and they are very innovative in what they're doing, and certainly working with them, they've got some amazing use cases of what they're trying to do with their networks. They're kind of leapfrogging some of the infrastructure-bound challenges that we have in Australia and New Zealand.
Yeah, James, what are you seeing in the region, or even around the world, in any of these areas that we've just talked about?
Yeah, I wanted to add a comment on top of what Chris is just mentioning, a very interesting point. And this kind of idea of personalization, in terms of billing, that's, is an interesting point, but also in terms of service, right? So, different people have different expectations about what they want. Do they want physical stores to go into? Are they okay with just purely digital as a way to engage? That also is an area where telcos can, and I think they are starting to, right, in this area in terms of innovating in terms of different cost models to offer different kind of levels of service for people who need different levels of service. And of course, everyone does, right? Some people, their devices is critical to their business, and therefore it's very, very important, whereas for others, maybe less so. So I think there's some kind of interesting sort of parallel innovation that goes on kind of in that space. And I think kind of the interesting point about the network as well, and the resilience of the network, and you add to that kind of within urban areas, you've also got in-building coverage as well as like towers. So really, there's a lot of resilience right there. But then when I was working at Optus, what was quite interesting is some of those kind of regional areas where there's less, right, reliant on one or two towers and how you manage that. And it's kind of an edge use case, right, particularly in this country where we're all very kind of focused in metro areas. But there's definitely some interesting work that telcos do in that space in terms of how they optimize investments in those places as well, in terms of maintenance and in terms of build. But that's kind of can be kind of a very interesting space, I think.
Interesting. Okay, I'm gonna try and I always try to keep my podcast.
To be fair with the Australian networks, I think some of them are also trying to do the right thing and have initiatives to bring value. Optus, for example, is offering now services to gamers that they want to skip some hops, so to reduce the latency. They have started offering that service recently, and they are also being very active in the IoT scope. So I think that also is another area, where I think telcos are the best suited to extend and to leverage the possibilities and start providing their own solutions. Because I agree with what you said before, they are followers mainly, and it's like, oh, someone is now innovating and they are using my infrastructure, I'm gonna tax them somehow, right? So I've heard that many times since I was in Spain. The very famous César Alierta, CEO of Telefonica, he was trying to tax Google for using Telefonica network for many years. He was never able to do it, right? Because you can do it. But, I think there are companies that are really trying to do the right thing. MBN, I think it's also trying to innovate and be more efficient. I was part of a team that was doing a lot of effort in not only the predictive maintenance, but also in the diagnosis of network failures. They have very advanced systems that could tell you even problems in the cabling inside your house. So I think that the stories are there. And maybe what I found is like a big asymmetry or imbalance in between the telco, more technical hardware part of the company, and the business spreadsheet driven part of the company. That is where I think the data is probably not well structured, not well suited in order to be able to introduce the machine learning algorithms, or even to do data visualization or data analysis that could help them to move forward.
Interesting. I saw a smile flash over your face, James. What were you thinking right there?
No, I think Jose's hit the nail on the head. The point I was going to make is, telcos have and continue to do very innovative things, particularly in the data science space, because they have so much data, right? And they attract good data scientists, because good data scientists go, this is a company with a lot of data and there's some good work that I can do here. So, whenever we go in and talk to different telcos, I always find that they're doing really cool stuff. It's just, whether that kind of permeates through to the business, I think depends, really depends upon the telco and kind of the environment they're operating. But all telcos, I think, are doing some really cool and innovative stuff in the data science space.
Interesting. Okay, let's jump up a level and let's fast forward 5 or 10 years. What are the telcos doing with their massive amounts of data? Let's 5G's out there, maybe 6G's in the research phase. New players, new competition. What does the telco of the future look like? And I'm thinking also here of fourth industrial revolution, IoT, the idea of automating all of your like any process that can be documented can be automated, right? Process automation, RPA, IPA, all those kind of things, you know. But what does the telco of the future look like if we jump forward 5 or 10 years? Jose.
Okay, so I think telcos, as you have mentioned also at the beginning, now they have become like a bit of a cost utility. Everybody takes them for granted, so everybody tries to pay the least, right? So they need to optimize then their expenses, right? And they are also famous for having to run those gigantic call centers, right, where they never able to probably give like the user experience that the customers expect. No? So I think there is an opportunity there to exploit that data from customers to maybe introduce artificial intelligence in replacing some of those agents in call centers for chatbots, you know, that can maybe interact with the user in a way that the user can still receive the information that is needed and maybe assist him during the call, right, during the interaction in modifying, diagnosing the network and giving the user steps, right, to solve the problem, right? And not waiting for 10 users to call reporting a problem, but based on the action from the first 3, they should be able to know that the same problem is affecting other 100, right? So you don't need to, because the problem is on, you know, a central device that is failing. So I think there is all these opportunities there that they can optimize themselves, but also at the same time improve the user experience when customers need to interact with them.
Interesting. James, what are your thoughts? Telco of the future.
You know, working as a data scientist and in prediction, I actually hate making predictions like this. So, you know, I think that, you know, they've survived, right? They've survived a lot of disruption. And I assume that they will continue to. They provide an essential services, you know, the network, which that's going to obviously be important going in, you know, into the future. I definitely think that's the case. So I think that they will play a role. What role they play will depend upon how quickly they can kind of innovate, I think, you know, over the next few years. And we'll see that. We'll see how that plays out, I guess, you know, from that perspective. But I think, you know, interestingly as well, the question here is kind of like what role they play and how they help also kind of in terms of the equality in terms of the 4th industrial revolution. Like, you know, in terms of we've seen from other, you know, previous kind of step forwards, there's winners and losers. So how does the telco help in terms of equality in the 4th industrial revolution? I think that's important. That'll be interesting to see how that plays out into the future. But please don't make me make a prediction about the telco of the future.
Fair enough. No, good point. No, I appreciate your point on that question of equality, particularly coming out of COVID, where, you know, some nations have been smashed economically. Yeah. The challenges of poverty are going to emerge next year in a way that we haven't seen before. Telcos may have a part to play in that. In fact, I have a keynote on that subject, but that's another topic. Dr. Chris Cook, your thoughts on the telco of the future?
Look, I think the telco of the future has got, as was mentioned, a social responsibility to support the community that it serves. We're seeing quite a migration of population, and we saw it during COVID. As people went to lockdown, they actually disappeared from the cities and went back into the countries, and certainly across the region. Not so much in Australia, but there has been a significant move to the country. You know, people working 3 or 4 days a week from a remote location. So, you know, services like Sky Muster and those sorts of things, you know, and the latest competitors, the Google satellite network and the Elon Musk and satellite network as well. You know, those competitors are going to impinge as well in the Australian landscape, because we are just so vast and it is so hard to send data across such large distances. But I think, you know, we can learn from in this country, we can learn from other countries who've got already a very dispersed population. Indonesia, for example, Thailand, Vietnam, those countries have all got a significantly larger population than ours, and telephone networks that are supporting them. And they've kind of skipped, and in India in particular, they've skipped the copper wire basis, and it's all mobile. So, you know, we have lessons to learn there. but I think supporting the economic recovery and the dispersal of the movement of people from the cities into the country in Australia will be important. It's interesting because 10 or 15 years ago, the telcos were all saying, well, how do we drive volume? How do we drive volume across the network? What are the apps that are going to drive it? And IoT started to become something big. It was going to drive lots of volume across the network. Well, things are now driving lots of volume across the network, and we're kind of complaining about it because the networks are utilities. So the government, stepped in initially, it stepped out, and now we've got multiple players, and Telstra, it's privatized. They'll step in again and rebalance or re-level the playing field. But we're going to have that swing backwards and forwards like we have in the electricity industry. Government regulation backward, in and out. And, in New South Wales, we ended up with a gold-plated electricity distribution network. We have, to what extent do we have that in our telco networks nationwide? I don't know. I'm not in a position to judge that, but I think we're going to see quite a bit more government intervention in it to make sure that there are even less disadvantage for remote areas and Indigenous populations. There's been articles on that just recently as well. But I think that's where AI and bias and serving all customers equally, but still discerning for those customers, that's going to be the challenge for AI in supporting the initiatives that the telcos are deploying. So how do we discern credit risk without prejudicing the disadvantaged, for example, those kind of things. So there's interesting challenges in the social and AI and not biasing the services that we provide.
Yeah, no, I think you've hit the nail on the head. There is that challenge, isn't there? So you've got a certain social responsibility as a telco. You've got the ability of AI to, like you've said, potentially in a worst case scenario, discriminate against people who genuinely need a service simply because they don't have a credit history, or in the case of Indonesia, they may not even have a bank account, they may not have a birth certificate, let alone a credit card. And yet, if a farmer in outback Indonesia can get a phone, he can call ahead to the city, find out what the price of rice is, decide whether does it justify his time to load up his cart, go in and sell some rice, buy some fertilizer and come back, or are the prices such that he's better to stay and spend a day working in the field and wait till the prices are better? Without a phone, he's got no way of knowing. With a phone, he's got a way of finding out. So I think that the potential for uplift at any level, whether you're talking developed world or developing world, is definitely there. It'll be interesting to see how that balance between ethics, running a telco with a good conscience, and also government intervention or regulation is going to play out. I'll just open up to either Jose or James for final thoughts, and then we'll introduce our Scotch of the week.
One more thought. That was today on the news, right? So the telcos are being threatened with fines if they fail to stop spam calls, right? I think that's showing like there is improvement. There's room for improvement in their service. No, they could reduce maybe the load on their networks if they are able to cut non-legitimate traffic, not only spam calls, but I'm talking now also about all the cybersecurity space, right? So they could disrupt the cybersecurity industry if they wanted maybe to say, okay, we're going to take like a more central role, and all these, DDoS services, anti-DDoS services that are provided, we could provide them, right? So they can level their services up on that space probably easier than anyone, right? So we're talking about when they are disrupted, but they have also the opportunity to disrupt. No, it's probably is that maybe they need to have like a more innovative mindset in order to do that. No, as you mentioned before, also typically they are slow, and mostly my experience when at Telefonica, for example, is that their way of growing was mostly buying companies or getting in collaborations with other companies, right? So, but they are not good at innovating and producing services themselves.
Yeah, no, I like it. I like that a lot. It's interesting because we don't seem to think about that much. I mean, the telco actually has the ability to intervene if there's a commercial or regulatory incentive to do so, to reduce that burden of cybersecurity on all of their subscribers, right? And then you've got the idea of we've seen an uptick in online exploitation, and it seems to be the federal police are the only people screaming about it, but the telco and of course Westpac now hit with over a $1 billion fine, or a $800 million fine for not picking up micro payments that were going for the purpose of exploitation in the Philippines. A telco could pick up a lot of that from a signals perspective potentially. I mean, there seems to be a lot more.
Look, Mark, they have a conundrum there, in that as soon as they start stepping into that realm, they step away from their ability to say, well, look, we can't regulate the money laundering that goes on. We can't regulate those things because all we are is a pipeline. And if you're starting to say, no, we're not a pipeline, we're now going to clamp on those that are illegally using our services, it's the same argument that Twitter has, that Google has, and all those sorts of things. If you're publishing things, and all you are is the pipeline, you don't have any responsibility for people publishing, inflammatory information about the US election, for example.
Indeed. And
they can't have it both ways.
Exactly. There's a rabbit hole we're about to go down that we don't have time to go down. But
that's right.
Let me. Oops, Daisy! I just knocked over my table. Not a problem.
Have you been drinking that already, Mark?
No, I haven't.
It's an empty bottle.
The way the bottle was holding the table that was balancing the microphone. So there you go. Anyway, the comment on Kavalan was fantastic whiskey. It's not actually a Scotch. It comes from Taiwan. But definitely worth a try. The other interesting thing about this one, and my usual disclaimer applies. Okay, so anybody who's watching, if you are on a 12-step program, don't jump off the wagon because of my advertising. Your friends and your family need you to stay on that thing. So, but I mentioned, I think, in an earlier episode about finishing off whiskeys in bourbon casks, and it's like, no, just don't do that. If you're going to have bourbon, have some bourbon. If you're going to have scotch, have some scotch, but don't finish off your scotch in a bourbon cask. It's just a crime against good scotch. However, these gentlemen have hit the nail on the head, finishing their whiskey off in port casks, which actually works quite well. Yeah. So I will recommend to you Kavalan, all the way from Taiwan. Fantastic whiskey. Gentlemen, thank you for your time. I really appreciate it. It's an unusual time slot, 5 o'clock on a Wednesday afternoon, but we've had a lot of fun. I've really enjoyed the discussion, and look forward to potentially hosting you in a future episode.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, James. Thank you, Jose.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Stick around. Here we go.